publication that I won't go into now because it's a little bit tight on time for this afternoon presentation. So again, I know we welcomed Dr. Mayo already, but one more time, let's give a warm welcome to Dr. Cris.
Well, thanks so much for having me. And we're starting a kind of a new thing at our center and asking people to do kind of a pre-test, post-test. Now, you all look like I might be preaching to the choir, so that's good, but whatever. So I'm asking if you would fill out the first half now and the second half as we get near the end. And let me know, sound okay for everybody? Okay, so I'm going to talk to you about some basic definitions and context for thinking about trans, non-binary, and intersex people, because I want to make sure that we understand that gender diversities are not new. I also want to talk about the differences between trans and non-binary experiences. There are some things I'm going to go through fairly quickly because we only have 45 minutes and generally I take a couple hours. Talk about obstacles and rights, and I think many of you know exactly what those are, and then talk about learning to be a better ally. So I want to start out by just saying, even though I do not think the experiences of gender diversity across transcultural contexts and transhistorical contexts are exactly the same, it's worth knowing that we have talked about gender diversity in many cultures for a very long time. So if you look at the cute little picture from the Philippine sitcom, which was called Girl, Boy, Bakla, Tomboy, you can see that even in Philippine popular culture, the reflection of at least 4 genders is clear. It's also clear in Thai culture and certain cultures in the continent of India and so on and so forth. So we could talk about that. We could also talk about the gender option in 17th century, 18th century Naples rather, or among the Zuni in the United States, that there are more than 2 genders. So this is not necessarily a new thing. And we could also talk about the scientific study of sexes and genders with Magnus Hirschfeld's Institute in Berlin from about, say, 1919 to about 1933, when he was kicked out by the Nazis and his books were burned. And in fact, if you see one of the very famous pictures of Nazi book burning, they're burning one of Magnus Hirschfeld's books. You can also see very dimly, unfortunately I didn't get a really good picture, but Pakistan is now issuing passports with a 3rd gender with the marker X. So what we're talking about in the United States that is giving us a lot of anxiety in popular culture and in political issues is not a new thing and is not specific to the United States. There are things that are new and different about how we think about trans, but nonetheless, I want to give you some sense that these are not people who have newly arrived and are making things up. This is a very long tradition in human diversity. The Williams Institute at UCLA has found that 0.6% or 1.5 million people in the United States are trans. That's probably a fairly conservative estimate because they used data off the US Census and they extrapolated data from some other small sets. I think if we start to talk about trans, non-binary, and intersex, we start getting up to populations that are closer to about 3 million. And if you start talking to the younger generation, those of you who are coming to university now, a lot of people in the younger generation are identifying as non-binary. They have a critique of how gender roles and how we think about gender in the United States, and they are just basically giving up on gender. And so those populations are going to get bigger if we think about all of these groups together. West Virginia has the highest percentage of trans youth ages 15 to 19 of any state in the United States. After 19, the population drops back down again. But as we know, a lot of young people are leaving the state of West Virginia. So part of what I'm hoping in doing trainings like this, and again, I think I'm probably preaching to the choir, is to say we need to become a friendlier state. We have a long tradition of hospitality. We have a tradition of family, a sense of family and community. And as we continue to deal with the kinds of hostilities that are coming out of some governmental offices, I think we need to bring those traditions to the fore and try to make it possible for trans people to stay in West Virginia. You can see that when we look at studies of people who are in universities, we've got about 8.5% on the queer spectrum, 0.4% trans students. So there are a fair number of LGBTQ plus students in universities. The more we think about this, the better off we are. When you look at the percentages at research universities, the percentage of trans students goes way up to 1.7%. So One thing I will say about trans people is they're very smart, and that's worth thinking about. In 2008, only 8% of people surveyed had known a trans person, but by 2015, you can see that number's doubled. So not only, I think, are we beginning to understand more about how we need to be inclusive, the fact that we are beginning to understand how to be inclusive means that more trans people are feeling comfortable coming out to us. And that means that we want to continue being a good ally. So usually when I do safe zone trainings, I know many of you were there, the last time I did a safe zone training here, we talk about being an ally needing to be a very strong, committed set of activities that you do, not just an attitude. So I'm going to talk about the fact that you want to be respectful of pronouns, respectful of names, look at your institution's facilities, look at the forms you use, the language you use to address people, and see whether you're being exclusionary. It's basically saying an ally is someone who does an assessment and who fixes problems that they find. Gender, we think, is a pretty easy definition, but it turns out it's not that easy. We can very often say, well, there's only two sexes. We know this through the binary chromosome sets, XX, XY. It turns out, of course, that humans have at least 5 major chromosomal variations. And when hormones come into play, the number of gendered options increase exponentially. So once we think about the fact that gender markers are all over the human genome, they're just not present in hormones, they're just not present in chromosomes, and there's certainly a very large social component to how we do gender, we realize there's much more gender diversity than a binary could ever give us. Cisgender just means having the same gender identity as the gender assigned to one at birth. And cisgender is a word that was invented by trans people who just got tired of saying non-transgender people, which seemed like a negative formation, and they decided, let's take a term from biology and make this a word that we could use instead of saying you're not something, which I think is also a very clever thing to do. Transgender just means having a different gender identity from the gender identity you were assigned at birth. It can mean that you wish to transition through hormones, through social performance, or through surgery. It can mean a whole different variety of different ways of transitioning. And it can include wanting to conform or wanting to not conform. So non-conforming people are also sometimes considered trans. Gender creative people are also a growing group of young people in public schools are beginning to identify as gender creative, not transgender. And people who are refusing gender are claiming the term agender. I think refusing gender is a really hard thing to do. One of my very close friends is agender, and it's a very difficult thing to do, and all of your documents are always going to position you as gender, to say that gender is not just going to work for me. We all probably know what GLBH stands for. Those are sexual orientations. Sometimes in trainings people will say it's very important to make a distinction between sexual orientation and gender identity. That's kind of complicated because gender identity and sexual orientation also go together. And so I prefer to see these as interlaced rather than saying this is one thing and this is another thing. Because the way people are attracted to gender and the way people do their own gender is very much bound up with who they desire. There are new labels, and these are just a few of them: homoromantic, pansexual, asexual, non-binary. Homoromantic are people who don't particularly feel like having sex with somebody but have a deep attraction to someone of the same gender. I raise this because a graduate student and I completed a large project a couple years ago, and we asked the people that we interviewed, it was a retrospective study of their experiences of high school based on college memories, identify as LGBT. And everybody could do that. And then we said, what is the term that you identify as? And nobody replicated the first column. So it turned out that all 50 people that we interviewed used one of the new terms to self-identify rather than the classic terms that we have concretized in the title of my center, LGBTQ+, which, by the way, I didn't name. And I think it shows us that the kind of terminology that people are using is changing. And we need to try keep up with those changes and also try to figure out how those changes in words connect with other kinds of dissatisfactions. We tend to use the Philadelphia flag at my center because we want to emphasize the intersectionality of race and ethnicity with thinking about gender and sexual orientation. And so you see it's got the black and brown line on it to really put race forward in how we're thinking about sexuality. as we think more about intersectionality, we want to be thinking about how all these differences interconnect, so that when we do a training on something like trans safe zones, we also want to make sure that we understand that trans identity, non-binary, intersex identity also intersects with these other categories of identity. It is hard to keep up with all of this. If you point to the flags and ask me to identify them, I can't, because, well, I fall behind. And I think thinking really carefully about why we fall behind, sometimes generationally. I'm writing a chapter right now on the generational differences in gender nonconforming and trans communities. And it's interesting to think about the fact that we think we're talking about a group of people, but it is a very complicated interaction with other forms of identity, including things like classism, ableism, discrimination against veterans, and so on. And so as I do these trainings, I also want to think, well, on the one hand, I want to help people become better trans allies, but on the other hand, I want people in trans and gender nonconforming communities to think about whether they're living in racially exclusive groups, whether there's something else going on with gender in their community. So to problematize our practices within the communities that we live in as well. We need to remember that people of color and gender nonconforming people were at the forefront of our movements for freedom. And so it's important that we do those kinds of lessons. Intersections also show us that gender is racialized. So in a way, doing gender as a transgender person who is a person of color, you're doing a different kind of gender. We're going to see later that there are some negative things that come along with that in terms of the hatred that circulates. Genders beyond the binary, too, are indigenous to many cultures. So even though we might seem like it's a new thing among white-dominant populations in the United States, the kinds of gender diversities that people are enacting come from their traditions as well. So if you look at American Indian tradition and Two-Spirit people, you'll see that they're an old form of gender that's being brought back. This isn't an innovation, this is an older thing, and that's something I talked about a little bit earlier. Gender norms are also complicated in relationship to race, class, ethnicity, and sexuality, so we may not always quite, in our communities, recognize one another. We might not know what one another is doing, and I usually tell the story at this point about a friend, a black woman in college, who kept coming out to me, and I didn't recognize it because I didn't recognize the words she was telling me. So she kept telling me, I'm going home to see the children. I think you would like that. I was like, I don't know, kids, they're short, whatever. Yeah, sure, fine. But then it turns out that when she was saying the children, she was telling me she was part of a gay community in Harlem, and for years I didn't get it until finally I said, Helen, how's the children? And she said, and she started talking about them in more detail, and they weren't children, not children at all. So sometimes we don't know what's going on around us, even though we think we ought to. To go back to some of the basic issues I talked about earlier, you may remember the Kinsey Scale of Sexual Behavior. Has anybody read both volumes of Kinsey's Foundational Studies, 1948, 1953? Really big, very interesting. But one thing Kinsey found in 48 and 1953 was that most people are not on either side of the spectrum. Most people are not exclusively straight or exclusively gay, and so many people are in the middle. When we look at something like the gender unicorn, it gets us to think about the fact that people have a different gender identity from their gender expression. They have a different sex assigned at birth. They're physically attracted to people along the lines of gender, or they're emotionally attracted to people along the lines of gender, and none of these things have to be incongruent. So I identify as, occasionally, a big old butch, which works out fairly well. Among my trans friends, gender nonconforming, and so on and so forth. And when people start attacking women, then I just kind of slide back into being a good old woman feminist. So I think here's another thing to keep in mind. People have multiple ways that they associate themselves with gender, and the more that we're understanding that these things are complicated, the better off we are, because then we don't assume just because someone came out to us once as something that they can't keep learning and growing. When I went home in the 2nd grade and told my mother I was starting to learn the multiplication tables, she did not assume that I would not later learn division. So we live and we grow, and I'm not saying that gender is exactly like math, but I probably am. So anyway, if you're in the trans community or the gender nonconforming community, you may know that there are a couple of different models of thinking about our identities. In some cases, and my friend who's agender bros me continuously, and I think it's a lovely expression of how close we are. And yet, by the same token, the fact that my friend uses hormones and I don't, I think means that my interactions with doctors are very different, that my experience of being insured is a very different experience than my friend's is. And so I think we move in and out of these different kinds of models, whether we associate together because we're misrecognized by our gender continuously, or whether we divide ourselves because our experiences with the medical institution are just really different things for gender nonconforming and for trans people. It's good to have these conversations about how we have something in common and sometimes how we're also different from one another. And that, to me, is the mark of a very good kind of community where thinking and talking about what gender means is what we do. We don't just walk into a conversation and say, no, that's wrong, unless, of course, you're on Facebook or Tumblr or something like that. And we do that all the time. I would show you a video, but we don't have time. All right, anyway. So I want you to keep in mind some of the basic forms of bias that we're all up against. Heterosexism, the belief that heterosexuality is superior to homosexuality. Sexism, the belief that binary gender is the only possibility. Misogyny, which is the hatred and disparagement of things feminine, whether you are born feminine or whether you present as feminine, whether your identity is feminine, you are always subject to misogyny. Homophobia is the cultural fear and disparagement of people who don't conform to heterosexist norms, and sometimes that's also linked to misogyny. It doesn't mean the misogyny that cis women experience is the same thing that the misogyny that effeminate gay men experience. It doesn't mean it's the same misogyny exactly as trans women experience. But it does mean we have to be thinking about misogyny when we're thinking about the issues we're talking about. Transphobia is fairly clear. People are now moving to calling it anti-trans bias instead of taking up this language of phobia, because there's so much bias that is put into laws and policies now that it's not a phobia. It's beginning to be a regularized practice. Racism is the cultural and political fear of people of color. Transmisogyny is the collision of transphobia and misogyny. And what you're going to see later when I talk a little bit about hate crimes is that racist transmisogyny is one of the most virulent collisions that we're experiencing in the United States right now. Although, having just listened to the news about what's going on the border, I might withdraw that slightly. Are there any terms that you're not familiar with? Just want to do a little check-in here. Gender creativity. That's people starting to take the pieces of gender that they're interested in and do new and different things with them. So thinking, on the one hand, maybe they want to enjoy dance, but they also enjoy being a rugby player, and trying to mix and match in ways that kind of throw people off. Sometimes I get into these discussions, especially when I'm in gender nonconforming and gender creative communities, where we start to argue about what counts as non-binary and what counts as gender creative. And at that point, I actually think people are making stuff up, because when you move from community to community, each term has a slightly different meaning. And I think we are at the point in thinking about trans, non-binary, gender creative, and agender people where we have to realize that those definitions may vary from place to place. And sometimes gender creativity may just mean something like sequins, which I think is highly gender creative in any gender. So another thing I think is useful to talk about when talking about how to be an ally is how to actually think of yourself as not being an outsider working with people, but being someone who also has some of these struggles in common. They're not exactly the same, but they are in common. So I wonder if anybody would share any dissatisfactions they have with their gender role. It's irritating to be a woman because when I do this with my classes, the women will always say, because I run down hallways while men hold open the door for me. And I think, yeah, that is kind of an irritating aspect of being a woman. It's not a real physical thing, it's just how we do gender. Any dissatisfactions? Yeah. There you go. So even though that may not always get in the way of your everyday life, and it may, at the end of the day, you may figure out you just need to carry that blasted purse, because why do smartphones weigh 2 pounds? Anyway, we're not going to go down that rabbit hole. But there are days when I think, I just need a backpack for this stupid thing. Anyway, But there are forms of being that we just don't like. And we don't have enough, sometimes, gumption to do anything about it because people would remark, "You're looking tired," if you didn't wear makeup. They'll find that little crack in what you're doing and they'll start to figure there's something wrong. Any other dissatisfactions? Yeah. Right. So will you take notes for us at this meeting? I'm just always like, yeah, no. No, that's not happening. And for men, I was just talking with some young men at WVU, Potomac State, Kaiser we're now calling it, sorry. I don't want to get the branding thing wrong. And one of the young men says, I'm just very worried about how people think about my relationship with children because it always looks like I'm doing something wrong if I'm interested in working with children. He wanted to go into elementary education, but we have such a cultural bias against men working with young children. That's a problem. So I think just want you to get the idea that this kind of gender dissatisfaction and kind of critique of gender norms that trans and non-binary people do is part of what we all often do. And we just got through Thanksgiving. I was quietly alone and didn't get into any of the usual arguments that I would have. But I think Thanksgiving is a wonderful festival of gender dissatisfaction. And it's always good to just try to walk it off. So gender and recognition, I think, is a really important thing to think about. There are a lot of words on a lot of slides. I want to run through this so we have some time for conversation. But gender is one of the first ways that we're recognized, both at birth and by strangers. And so as I get you to think about the fact that we have dissatisfactions, we also have to realize it's a key way that we know one another. And people get frustrated if they can't figure out what your gender is. And the more people get frustrated with people not fitting into categories, they don't get curious, they don't get friendly, they tend to get kind of angry. And that's, I think, something we need to think about. We also need to think about the fact that gender is a key way we organize institutions. You cannot use a restroom without being confronted with a binary gender. Talk about that a little bit more. You can't use a locker room, you can't use a dormitory, you can't use many of your travel documents. So all of these things get really complicated. We can talk about the fact that we're dissatisfied with gender, but many facets of the institution and many forms of interpersonal recognition come right back in later. And even though laws don't explicitly recognize gender expression or gender identity, there's some indication, and I don't know how this is going to go. I used to watch the Supreme Court very carefully, and I think for the next 20 years I'm just going to be sitting quietly at home and burying my head in July. But there are circuits in the United States, including the Fourth Circuit, which West Virginia is in, that have recognized that gender identity is covered by many of the laws that cover sex discrimination. Whether this is going to stand is a whole other thing, and I don't want to get sad yet. We need to think about the fact that trans experiences are diverse, that people are increasingly identifying as trans as younger. They're able to access hormone blockers so that they can put off the age of consent and decide what they want to do with their bodies to a point where they've really given this quite a lot of thought. This is not the same experience that many people in the older generation had because we didn't have the technologies and we didn't have the acceptance. When people transition later in life, they change their relationships to people. Now that is also true of people who are younger, but if you think about the fact of changing your relationship to a spouse, to other family members, and so on, that's a very difficult process to go through, and probably many of you know examples of people who transitioned later in life and the other partner's sexual orientation is in some way impacted if they decide to stay together. People who love one another may be able to make it through that, and I actually know quite a number of couples who have, and it's not a problem. Some people may choose to transition and live only in relationship to their chosen gender identity, the gender identity that they have always felt that they had, and go stealth about their identity as trans. So you don't have to always be trans to be a trans person. At a certain point, if you choose a binary gender, just be that gender. That's a really different situation than people who decide to stay non-binary or who transition and then maybe determined to be agender or something else. I want you to get the idea that there are different ways of approaching these things. Some people find access to health care difficult and unable to keep up with the transitions that they started. Sometimes people take jobs where they were known as a gender that they were attributed to at birth, and they can't change because of where the job is. And there are stories of people who had to stop their transitions, take a short-term job, and come back and resume their transition. So we can't assume that everyone's transition is going to work in the same way. It is important, though, to think about, as an ally, how to be affirming of the variety of choices that people make. So affirmation and confirmation is the process by which trans people shape their bodies and find recognition for their identities. In most states in the United States, you have to go through a process of social transition where you begin to live in your gender and you're recognized as your gender before a doctor will be willing to work with you on hormones or on surgery. Now, there's some work against this right now because this is one of the few areas of medicine where a doctor makes you wait. There's another area of medicine that has a wait period with it, and we're starting to have some very interesting conversations between women who are interested in reproductive freedom, or people with uteruses who are interested in reproductive freedom, and people who are interested in doing transitions, because they're both freighted with this wait period where it is assumed that the person making the decision is not competent. Most of the studies on people who are trans and wish to transition show that they have been trying to get attention of somebody to help them with that transition for 7 years by the time someone finally recognizes them. So this is not something that just leaps on someone in a day. And what trans advocates are starting to say is that we don't understand well enough yet that people have been articulating their desire to transition for a long time by the time someone notices. And so when you think about the fact that there are wait periods built in, a lot of trans people are saying, we've already waited. We've already gone through this period. We've given this a lot of thought. We've known this since we were 4, and so on and so forth. And so if you go through that social transition period, that is an additional wait time. And it's a really difficult wait time, especially if you're going for a hormonal transition or if you're asking for surgery, because it's the time that you are required when you are most not recognizable as the gender you are to get recognition from people who are hostile. Because they've noticed that you've changed, they don't accept you, you don't look right, and so on and so forth. Those are forms of prejudice I'm articulating. I'm not saying that I believe that. That is a really difficult thing. And so when you meet someone who is going through transition, as an ally, please be very supportive. Do not out them. Do not tell anybody else things about them that they don't want told. And if you want to give them a little congratulations for what they're doing, I think that's great, but don't be patronizing. We just need to realize that people are required at a time when they may not be recognizable to be recognized. That takes a lot of effort. And so as you think about how to be an ally, think about, please, being very supportive of people who are making the effort. They're not making things up. Hormonal transition, affirmation, or confirmation happens either when youth are nearing puberty and they wish to have hormone blockers and go through the puberty of their gender identity, not their body's identity, or when people later decide that they want to use hormones. And they also tend to go through another kind of hormonal puberty. And so if you're working with somebody who is transitioning, or if you yourself are transitioning, or if you're starting to use hormones, just realize and talk to your doctor about this. You will be going through changes that will affect you. That you may have waited for this for a very long time, but it doesn't mean everything is going to be perfect and easy, because it's actually hard, as any of us who have used hormones know. They do change the way that you approach the world, and they can make you moody. I won't tell you about my friends. My friends will probably tell you about me. I managed to be moody anyway. Surgical transition, affirmation, or confirmation is when people make their own decisions about the degree to which they wish to do a surgical transition. People can change their minds along the way. And I don't mean change their minds in a flitting way. I mean, think very carefully at each stage in their transition about what they want to do. And it's important to remember, as an ally or as someone in the community as well, that we don't get into arguments over what kind of transition is the right kind of transition. We all make the transitions we want to make. We all do what we want to do. And if later on we rethink about it, and I don't mean rethink about it without taking a lot of care, I mean thoughtfully engage in how we want our bodies to be shaped, we deserve respect. Now, all of us, because we have human and changing bodies, make decisions along the way of our life to shape our bodies. I have apparently made the decision that I will no longer work out, and yet I will enjoy Pop-Tarts. This has had a certain impact on me, and I may want to revise that at some point. But it's a very thoughtful way that we engage in interacting with how we're embodied, how we present ourselves, and the risks we're willing to take. And the more that we engage in thinking about embodiment and thinking about how many options we have, I actually think the better off we all are. So as you think about being an ally, I really do want to just keep saying, there are some specific things that you can do. Here are some very particular things that are related to people who do transition. Laws that require mental health supervision. Having to go to authorities for permission for name changes. We've been working with students at WVU. I'll talk a little bit about this later because we have free name changes. But it turns out that the students immediately run into somebody asking them challenging questions. I'm Jewish. When people convert to Judaism, they're asked a lot of really irritating questions because we want to apparently make sure that you really mean it. I don't know. To me, it would be nice if you just welcome people in. But anyway, it's a very hostile process. For some of the students who've been trying to change their names, it's been a hostile process. That's a problem. Because again, these are people who have thought long and hard about who they want to be. They're looking for ways to make a difference in their lives, and they're running into obstacles. So I would ask those of you who are involved in institutional processes that are related to confirming someone's identity, don't be an obstacle. If you have personal issues that you want to discuss about transition, I'm happy to talk to you, but don't take it out on the person who is really making this choice. There are difficulties navigating legal and medical systems. Not having legal protection from discrimination is a major issue. It's a major problem when you think about the provision for insurance. WVU has a non-discrimination policy that includes gender identity, and it has an insurance policy that excludes transition-related care. Now, to me, just because I'm a philosopher, that's a logic problem. So a lot of the things that we do to be inclusive are kind of gestures towards being good allies to the people with whom we work, but institutionally we run up against problems. And so we need to be thinking, as we're thinking about particular obstacles and what we might be able to do, is to think about access to trans-inclusive health care, to plans, to healthcare providers who understand that trans people may still be at risk for diseases for the body that they were given at birth, not the body of their gender identity. And so trans men, for instance, getting ovarian cancer is certainly a problem. So we need to be thinking about the fact that there are these kinds of complex embodiments that doctors need to know more about. And we certainly need to be concerned that police or immigration officials aren't adequately recognizing someone because their documentation is not correct. I was pulled over by a police officer. I was just going to say, and I always say this, I was not speeding. It was in Ontario, and the officer asked me for my license. I was not speeding. I really, really wasn't. I really wasn't. I mean, this was going to get kind of ugly. And the officer kept saying, "Sir, I would like to see your license." And I just kept saying, "Ma'am." And he kept saying, "Sir." And I kept saying, "Ma'am." And, you know, I was actually kind of worried by the time I finally gave the officer my license. It was a lonely stretch of Ontario highway that there was going to be trouble. But it finally dawned on him why I kept saying "ma'am" at him, because he thought I was, anyway, we don't want to go down that. But the fact is, I'm white, I'm fairly privileged. The car wasn't the greatest car in the world, but it wasn't a terrible car. So I was feeling fairly confident, but I also had that moment of fear that I was being misrecognized and he was going to think I was a fraud. And that kind of fear is the fear that trans people have when navigating a world where their documentation does not quite match their identity. That kind of misrecognition, either during one's social transition or being misrecognized at one's transition or being misrecognized before one's documentation is in order, is just a perpetual cycle of concern. And so the more we as allies ask people their names and ask them how they want to be referred, the better off we are. But again, I want to say something I said before, which is if someone comes out to you, please do not assume they're out to everyone. So I had a meeting with teachers a couple years ago, talking about a problem student, and it was a student I was advocating for, the teachers knew the student in a different gender in each class. And we managed to go through the teacher conference, and the teachers all used different pronouns. And then at the end of the talk, they all kind of stared at each other and like, are we all talking about the same student? Well, it turned out the student had been navigating a really diverse understanding of gender in different contexts throughout the school day, and that was the moment that the student was outed. It was not our intention to do that, but it turned out that because the student had run through public spaces in really different ways, when it came time to talk about a difficulty, we had to all realize that the student was living a very variant gendered life, and we had to talk about that as well. That kind of complexity may be part of the sort of complexity that people who are not transitioning in the binary gender experience, which is they will never be adequately identified. And you can see here from this is a lovely flag that includes intersex and trans people together. One of the concerns as we have growing populations of people who do a binary transition is people who opt to do a more complex transition don't get recognized by the community they want to be a part of. And so there may be, this gets back to those two umbrellas I was talking about earlier, a real distinction between people who simply want to be a woman or want to be a man, or people who want to be non-binary. And try to think about those complications too, because it means that within our communities, we don't always get along. We sometimes have arguments. We sometimes call one another out as not being sufficiently radical about gender or whatever. That's a problem. And I think as we think about being allies, we need to think about being better allies to one another as well. So how do we assess and address obstacles? One thing we have to do is change our mindset when we're reading key documents, when we're looking at websites, when we're looking at forms. Do we ask for a binary gender where it doesn't matter? Do we ever give people the opportunity to identify as they want to be identified as? Do we have the expectation that if we do that, they will make those identifications? When I start to think about what we can do as somebody who's in an institution, one of the things we do is we signal welcome. We may not always get the data because people are actually kind of uncomfortable, imagine that, in this political climate to out themselves. So if you change forms to be more gender inclusive, it may be difficult to do that. If you offer gender inclusive restrooms, you may find that a lot of people want to use them because it's actually more pleasant. We do this at home, don't we? To have one toilet in a room rather than, whatever. I'm aware of the fact that we are recording this, so I don't want to go into a lot of detail, but it does turn out that most people are more comfortable using a private restroom. So here are a couple different things to keep in mind. There's a lot of words on this slide, and while I'm talking, please read them. Some of the things that we do to make our institutions more inclusive are universal design. There are ways that people who wish to have privacy when using the facilities can use them. You can use an ADA accessible restroom. We put a changing table in our restroom as well because we want it to be family friendly. Some of the changes that we want to make that are involving non-binary and trans people also involve people who have children and people with mobility disabilities. They also just make people feel more comfortable to use a restroom. That's a better thing for all of us to do. Some of the things that we do have to change the way we talk to one another. So I do not hail you as ladies and gentlemen because I assume that you are more than ladies and gentlemen. And I'm not just going to keep adding on names. I will just say, good afternoon. Good afternoon. I should have said good afternoon. By the way, I don't think I said good afternoon. Some of the common courtesies that we use are very exclusionary, so that means interrupting things that felt polite. Some of the ways that we organize space seem to make sense to architects maybe 40 years ago, but they don't make as much sense now, and they maybe didn't make as much sense then either. If you look at the ways that women have intervened in restroom design, because women take longer in the restroom, they want more stalls, what looked like equity in the old days turns out not to be equity at all if you look at the needs of people who were born women and still identify as women. If you look at the fact that people with children are going out into the world with those children more often, having family-friendly restrooms makes sense. If you have family-friendly restrooms and you are a family-friendly community, you're already mixing genders in your restrooms. The fact that you would then end a gender-inclusive restroom seems to me not really all that difficult. Again, part of universal design and how we might look at the obstacles that we have around us. We also need to be more open to the fact that people change who they are. We would expect, because we are in higher education, that all of you who come in as students do not leave the same way you came in. That's why we're here. I think when I talk about these things in educational institutions, it's especially important to think about the fact that we are asking people all the time to rethink what they know, who they are, how they're going to engage in community. And when we do this related to terms that are seemingly basic to some of us, we're actually asking ourselves to be more critical of our world than we were when we started. That means the younger people who are coming in and having trouble with older gender categories are teaching older generations how to think about gender differently. So we're basically being schooled. That's sometimes really hard, but I think it's important to remember that we're engaged in this kind of an education where it means we need to change some of the things that we do. The problem is that there's a lot of pushback against this kind of education. When you think about the level of violence against trans people in the United States or the lack of protections in law, you realize that there is quite a lot of rebellion about some of these changes. And in fact, when you talk to women who are cisgendered women, you think about the backlash against women too. Or when you talk about men, about cisgender men, so about some of the challenges they face because our understandings of sex roles haven't changed fast enough, you run into a lot of dissatisfactions. The dissatisfactions, though, that people express about trans people are often in the form of violence. The intersection of transphobia and racist trans misogyny is a real problem in the United States. Unfortunately, 2 trans people have been killed since I made the slide a week ago. So we're up to 24 trans people being killed in the United States so far this year. 31. When you look at the last year that data was taken, it's overwhelmingly trans women of color. It's overwhelmingly, too, people who are engaged in sex work, but not only, and increasingly we're seeing family violence is coming up almost as high as the level of violence against sex workers. I used to talk much more about the fact that people are pushed out of high schools and thus are pushed into kind of entrepreneurial activities that don't have the kinds of protections that regular jobs have, like sex work. And this is one of the problems of transphobia in high school, is that people are having to make life choices that are ultimately dangerous. But the other problem is that families are not welcoming. Parents, siblings, partners are murdering trans people, and that is a real problem that we also need to be talking about in our communities. We also need to realize that when we start to look for data, it is often not collected. So in West Virginia, gender identity hate crimes are not a data point. It's not a hate crime in West Virginia, so we don't collect that data. We don't know what goes on in our state. So it turns out that knowing more about what's going on is a really important thing. Nationally, hate crimes against trans people are unreported, period. But when you live in a place that doesn't even define what happens to you as a hate crime, there's an additional stress. And this may be partially why, after 19, we don't so much have the same number of trans people that we had before. This is a kind of a hard part of talking about West Virginia, because I've been in the state 3 years. I think it's a wonderful state, love the people. I have enjoyed just about everything about it except the politics. And you all can have whatever political ideas you want to have. I think having a robust public discussion about political ideas is a really important part of what makes this country wonderful and what makes the state vibrant and also, to me, frustrating. So our Attorney General is advocating legalizing discrimination against trans people. Our governor has signed on to a similar bill. The U.S. executive branch has rescinded guidance to protect trans kids in public schools, and as you probably saw in the news in the last couple of days, has asked the Supreme Court to ban trans people from the military, despite the fact that a lower court ruling has said that's unconstitutional. So we're at a time where on the one hand, people are being creative, people are asserting their identities, and on the other hand, there is really massive governmental backlash against them. And this is a very difficult thing to live through. And it's very hard then, when you're trying to talk more about who you are, to run into institutions that aren't caring. A number of large-scale surveys of college students have found that trans students need more mental health help, feel more isolated than other groups, experience partner violence at a higher level, experience penetrative rape at a higher level than other groups. And so for those of us in higher education, thinking about what the current context is doing to the experience of people who are starting to come out and claim their identities is a really important thing. These are a lot of negative outcomes, and when you think about lower levels of belonging, the more people feel like they are not a part of a community, the more they don't feel like they can reach out for help, the more they're not doing well in class, the more they're not engaging in the social kinds of activities that we know help make university an exciting and sustaining time, the more we as universities are not yet adequately serving the students who are coming to us, having done all this creative thought that's changing how we're thinking about identity. And so we need to figure out what to do to help students through this. The degree of bias on campus is a problem. The other problem is that we're not collecting enough data on it. WVU next year is going to be collecting data in the, can I remember which study it is? I think it's the National Study of Student Engagement. But the more we understand who's on campus, the better off we are. In some ways, it's better to get this data from these large organizations because students may feel more comfortable reporting something that isn't coming back to the university in any other form than aggregate data. Sometimes when you collect data in climate surveys at a university, you don't get enough student response, period, but you also get students who are kind of uncomfortable self-identifying, knowing that this is their university. So the more data we have, the better off we are. It's unfortunate the 2020 US Census is likely to not collect data on LGBT people. Got a lot of really interesting stuff out of the 2010 one, and hopefully we'll get back to it in 20 years. But here are some signals for how we can be more welcoming. We can change our restrooms. That's actually relatively easy. Like I said before, if you have an ADA accessible restroom, you might be able to change it. It would be good to have a conversation, though, with people who use wheelchairs or who need ADA accessible restrooms to make sure you have a sufficient number, that you're not pitting one group against another. That's also important. We don't want to get into a kind of a competition. But you can also see there's a whimsical approach to this. I've been to a few restaurants where I just look at the sign on the door and I have no idea whatsoever, so I'm hoping for the best. You know, that can happen. Basic recognition. We all know about this. Sometimes it is a good thing to offer your pronouns because it sets up a climate where other people will feel like sharing. Sometimes it's not a good idea to go around the room because that's a process where you might out someone before they want to be outed. And you put them in a difficult position. They might want to talk to you later about their chosen name and about their chosen pronouns, but they may not want to do it in a class of 50 in astrophysics. It may just be hostile. So know that people do this. If you regularize sharing your names, you might give people an opening, or you at least show people that someone around them cares. Everyone is not always going to respond to that, but you're going to start to make a kind of inroad in how people think about gender. It's roughly the experience of giving a lecture in, say, an Intro to Women's Studies class. Not everyone's listening, but you like to think you've done something. We also express allyship through policies and laws. We have a non-discrimination policy. Let's make sure people know about it. We're going to change our forms. Let's make sure people know about it. We have federal data reporting requirements that are binary gender, but then we're going to ask you an optional section so that you know that we know that things are more complicated than the federal government wants them to be. And I don't mean this particular administration. This has been a long-term problem. As we try to address sexism in the university, we want to get data on men and women, but it turns out those are not the only categories. So then we have to also add some optional stuff in. Organizational mission statements and core beliefs often give us the sense that we're all welcome and included, but are they always followed through with everyone? I honestly think one of the really hard things to do is to try to challenge practices of our colleagues. There's a professor at Penn State University. He doesn't make a secret of this. His name is Christopher Reed. He's a literature professor, and I don't say this to say terrible things about him exactly, but it's on his website. He will not use anyone's preferred pronoun. He says the only pronouns that we owe one another are I and me. That's the only thing you have control over. And I actually think he's kind of wrong. Well, I think he's wrong, not kind of. Because I think one of the things we owe one another is some form of respect that mirrors back who we are to one another. So if you tell me your name is Joe, I am not going to persistently call you Sam. That seems to me to be not just disrespectful, but just weird. So I think having those conversations are important. I should probably drop him a line because I talk about his website a fair amount. But I think it's important that we have conversations with people with whom we don't agree and give them some very strong arguments for why pronouncing students' names correctly, if they're names with which the professor is unfamiliar, is really important to being welcomed into a classroom. That's not about trans people. That's about all people. Remembering people's names is really important. I am awful at this. I was a bartender once. I walked to the bar of all these men that I used to wait on all the time, and I said, it's so funny, the 6 of you are here, and you're all named Robbie. And they went, no, he's Robbie. And I was like, wow, that's 2 years of knowing you guys really well down the drain. So I'm not good at this, so I need to be reminded. And I think remembering that sometimes we just make mistakes is something to do. But if all of that is not enough, there are still some legal recourses available. And so I would bear in mind that some of what we do wrong, if we do it wrong with hostility, may be covered by Title IX, may be covered by Title VII. It depends on where we live. It depends on our university's rules, the local ordinances, the state laws, the circuit courts, and so on. We don't have a state law here, but we do have local ordinances. I know you all know about that more than I do. We have a lot of institutional inclusions at WVU. Look at these and just feel great about us. I think about you guys. I think you're all really great too. All of what you're doing here is really wonderful. We have a living and learning community. I am searching everywhere for my phone to make sure I'm not going over time. A little. But I want you to think about the fact that you are doing inclusive things here and to think about the fact that you can do more. Keep pushing yourselves. Keep going further. There's more that we can do. And the more that we do, the more we keep that sense of belonging. All right, sorry to go over. Thank you all for your attention. And
Thank you. Those who may need to go to class, we understand. Those who might wish to stay for a little longer to ask questions.
And if you finish your form and hand it back in to me, I would be forever grateful. Because bow tie. There's, well, it really is in my contract. Also, I have 100, so, you know.